All right, for those of you that are here, I thank you for coming. We have about 30 minutes. She said it'd be finished about 12:15. So it may be a little bit later, I don't know. But we have about 30 minutes. I thank you for coming here. All of you have some kind of an interest, I'm assuming, in American Sign Language or in deaf ministry. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak to you about it. I hope that you can learn something so that you can apply it to ministering with deaf people. That's our goal. It's not about interpreting per se. It's not about anything else except to reach the deaf people for Christ. And let's get started. In order to understand about the language, and I'm not going to go real deep in the language, I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I hope that you're not in the category of a lot of people that think American Sign Language, well, where is it? It's this big nebulous thing out here, this cloud floating around that I can't ever find it. I can't grab onto it or understand what it really is. It does have a concrete set of rules. It does have an actual structure as any other language. And it's difficult for some people to understand that. Before we talk about that, I think it's important for you, not in your understanding of the language as much, but in your understanding of deafness, that you get a foundation for what deafness really is. What I mean by that is I hope I change your way of thinking, as a lot of people have the idea that deafness is a medical problem or a hearing problem. And I want you to kind of get away from thinking that it's not a problem medically or with hearing, but it goes deeper than that, and that it's a language problem. And if we start thinking about how people obtain and acquire language, we'll begin with an informal process. This holds true for anybody. It doesn't matter where they live geographically. It doesn't matter their nationality, their ethnic background. It doesn't matter whatever language it is. This basic format is true for everyone in the world. There's two processes to obtain and acquire language. The first one we'll start with is the informal process. This is pretty much what it says. It's informal. It takes place at home. It takes place at church. It takes place on the playground. It takes place with kids interacting with each other. So if you think about anyone, any child that's born anywhere in the world, they begin their informal learning process or their informal acquisition of language. And that happens through two channels. One is a receptive channel, and I'll put that under here. It's a receptive channel. If you think about how they receive information for their language, for those that are hearing, the way they receive it is through listening or hearing. That's how people begin to acquire language. A child's born. First thing the parents do is they start talking to the child. Friends do. They come and talk with the child. Child, I'm sure, doesn't understand it, but as time goes on, the constant listening is connected with certain words that they can begin to understand the language. Time goes on, and then there is another process, another channel in the informal process, and that goes from listening, the receptive channel, to the expressive channel. What then would be the expressive channel in the informal process? It would be speaking. If we're receiving information informally, a child's born, they listen, they hear, they receive information about their language, then they begin to express that information. How do they start to express the information themselves? They start speaking, they start talking. Holds true with all of us. They begin to speak. Once this is in place, 4, 5, 6 years old, they begin to go to school. The child sent to school, this process is now the formal learning process for their language. This is repeated again. We have a receptive channel, and we have an expressive channel. Again, this process is repeated. Now, this is already in place. They've already listened to their language. They've already spoken their language. Now they're going to learn about it, the structure of their language. And the receptive channel would be reading. If that holds true, then what's the expressive channel in the formal learning process? It would be writing. Some of you I know have heard this concept before. This informal learning process is built at home. It builds immediately. When they go to school, the formal learning process or language acquisition process takes place. This formal language process is based on the informal. This is already in place. The informal learning process has already happened. These kids have already listened to their language and spoken their language by the time they arrive at school. And then they begin to learn it formally, and they begin to read and learn to write. This is based on this. If this isn't in place, this is deficient. For deaf children, think about deaf children that's born into the world. 90% of deaf people have hearing parents. Most people think, well, if you're deaf, your parents were deaf. It's not the case usually. It's the other way around. 90% of the deaf people have hearing parents. Most of those hearing parents, statistics show, they don't know sign language of any kind. So they're left out there. This is not in place for the deaf child. And we see it all the time when one of the people that used to work here, Mr. Ed Davis, was a superintendent for the Tennessee School for the Deaf for 22 years. And he would tell me often that kids would arrive at 5 and 6 years old to go to kindergarten and first grade at TSD. And this is where they start, and none of this is in place. So they're already behind. Most deaf people graduate with a 9th grade reading level. That's an average. It's not for everyone. There's a lot of well-educated deaf people. There's a lot of deaf people with less than a 9th grade reading level. But most of them graduate with a 9th grade reading level. Why is that? It all goes back to this. Their language development is not in place because the informal language process is not there. So if you can just hang on to that, I hope that makes sense to you. If you just hang on to that, put that in the back of your mind, that will help us later. We'll try to tie this back in to ministering with deaf people. Now, what is American Sign Language? Switch gears a little bit. People are often not sure where to even begin to think of it. American Sign Language, often if you take something and try to explain it, it's a good idea to contrast it and say what it is not. I think I'll start with that. Let's start with what is it not, and then we'll go into what it is, and maybe that'll help you understand a little bit better. American Sign Language is not a shortened form of English. It's not an abbreviated form of English. Often people think it's English that's just shortened and made simplified. But it's not that at all. It's not abbreviated. It's not English on the hands. I hear that term a lot. I interpret a lot in the hospitals around Knoxville, and often when I start interpreting, many times the doctors, when they start speaking and they notice out of the corner of their eyes that I'm not signing, they'll turn and look at me and ask me why I'm not signing. Because American Sign Language is not English on the hands. In other words, if you say a word in English, doesn't mean that I need to sign that word on my hands. It's a completely different language. ASL is not dumbing down the English language. A lot of people use that term. Because it's not what we're used to and it's different, a lot of people don't understand the differences and they think, well, we're just simplifying it for these deaf people because they don't have their language built yet, which is not true. They do have their language built, but their language is American Sign Language. It's not English. And I'm speaking of people that are born deaf. There's a whole different way to think about some other people who lose their hearing or, go deaf later in life. But for those that are born not hearing, that's not always the case. It's not based on English. ASL is not based on English. If you can, as a student of American Sign Language, if you can get in your mind that American Sign Language has nothing to do with English, you're halfway down the ball field already. Most people take American Sign Language and they look at the rules and they'll look at the grammatical structure and they'll look at this and that and say that doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense to you because you're comparing it to English. You have to look at it as its own language. You have to look at it as these rules are not even based on English, and they're not. They're rules of themselves that govern their own language, just as other languages, French, Spanish, German, you name it, they have their own set of language rules and grammar and syntax that govern their language. This is no exception. But I think because it's more interactive with the English language, people get confused and they get it mixed up and they think, well, this doesn't make sense because it's this way in English. Why do I do it this way in American Sign Language? Well, you just don't get any preconceived notions as a student of American Sign Language what it is. Take it for face value if you're a student and a rule is explained, a grammatical feature is explained. If you can take that and accept that for what it is and not hold on to comparing it to English, then you're already ahead of the game here. So that's kind of what American Sign Language is not. It's not dumbing down English. It's not English on the hands. It's not even based on English. It's its own language. It's basically a language that's gestural. It's based on spatial agreement, use of space. It's a visual language. It's not a language that can be written. There is a form that people try to express American Sign Language called glossing, but it's not writing the language. It's a form of expressing the language on paper, but it's not truly writing the language because you can't write this language because it's a visual language. ASL, though, what is it? It's a visual, gestural language with its own syntax, its own vocabulary, and its own figurative language. Just like any other structured language, it has its own syntax. It has its own order to the sentence or usage for the parts of speech of the sentence. It has its own grammar. It has its own structure and its own figurative language. There's idioms in American Sign Language just as there's idioms in English and other languages. So if you can take that and understand that it is a separate language in and of itself, it does things like, yes, it does condense, it does summarize, but yet it doesn't dumb down the English language. Part of the characteristics of this language is summary in condensing the language. It omits articles that we use in English, a and the, things like that. Often in English we use those. Those are elements that we use to connect things and make things sound better. Those are not functional elements in American Sign Language. They're only used for emphasis. They're not readily used. American Sign Language follows the topic comment format. In other words, a good example is I speak of this chair being black. In English, we say that's a black chair. In American Sign Language, it's typically we'll speak of the chair as the topic and then comment on it and say that it's black. So you would sign in word order for American Sign Language, chair black. I hear that there's other spoken languages that way. I don't know any other spoken languages. But that's the structure of American Sign Language. It has its own morphology. It has morphemes, the smallest unit of meaning in a language. People think that signs don't have it. Well, they do have it. Some of the morphemes are on the mouth. It's the mouth shape. Some of them are simply hand shapes that represent what we would call the alphabet. It's not a letter in American Sign Language. It's a hand shape. It's an actual sign itself. If you make the sign for the letter S, yeah, that's what it is. It's a sign that represents what we connect as a letter in English. But it's actually a sign. It's not a letter. Well, morphology in American Sign Language can even be broken down into individual letters connected onto a word. There's bound morphemes. I'm not going to get into all this. Free morphemes, derivational morphemes, inflective. I mean, it just goes on and on. There's phonology in ASL just as in any other language. There's facial grammar. There's grammar that is placed on the face with your eyebrows, your lips, and things like that. An example of this is a true story. A deaf person, I think this happened in California, I read about it. A deaf person had come to another deaf person's home and wanted to ask for their parent. It was a deaf lady coming to see her deaf friend. When she rang the doorbell, of course, we know the light flickered inside the house and went off and on. A hearing child comes through the door and opens the door. They know each other, and the deaf person asked where their mother was, and they used the sign for where, and then they furrowed their eyebrows. They brought their eyebrows down like this, which asks a question. This is the grammar in that sentence. Asking a question is actually pulling your eyebrows down. And when they signed it like that, the child ran off mad. And not mad, upset. The child ran off upset, crying, because the child didn't understand grammar of American Sign Language. The child thought that she was angry. The friend comes to the door, rings the doorbell, the child opens the door, and the child understood where. She used the sign for mom, mom, where? And then she furrowed her eyebrows and brought them down, asking the question correctly in American Sign Language, where's your mother? But the child didn't understand it, thought from her facial expression that she was angry, and the child took off running through the house crying and upset. Just an example of the communication and the differences in the two languages. But there's grammar for distance. There's grammar for questions. There's grammar for change of topic on your eyebrows. You can actually pull your eyebrows up or down to change topics in a sentence. There's different kinds of verbs in American Sign Language, just as there is in English. There's spatial verbs where things are conveyed by moving the verb through the space. The actual meaning can be changed depending on where you move the verb. There's plain verbs. There's inflecting verbs. There's one man that often his influence isn't spoken enough to students of ASL. His name's William Stokey. He's a man that always wanted to be an interpreter. I didn't know him. I know people that knew him. He's deceased, but he was a student of American Sign Language. He wanted to be an interpreter, but he didn't have what it takes to be an interpreter. But it's through his work, he's the person that began the ball rolling as American Sign Language is its own language. He set the stage and presented things that I've just told you, and presented them to show that, listen, American Sign Language isn't based on English. It's its own language, and here are reasons why. The difference is he would go in and he would talk about inflective morphology, and he would explain the differences in that. I'm just telling you it exists. He would go in and he would support that there's phonology in the language. He would go in and he would support the grammar on the face and the grammar in finger spelling, and how that finger spelling is not random. People don't finger spell just because they don't know a sign, but there's actually grammatical rules as to when to finger spell. And it was because his work that started the research that now it's widely accepted in America, in Canada, that American Sign Language is its own language. It's even accepted often in colleges and institutions as a foreign language. And it's recognized that way. So that's kind of what American Sign Language is not. This is what it is. I hope that'll give a little bit of clarity as in your reach for what really is this language. Now, in thinking about that, I've written this scale up here, this diagram. If you can think about American Sign Language or ASL being on this end of this scale, on the right end of this scale, and English being on this end of the scale. As far to the left of this band that I've written up here, this is the English language. This is pure English. As far to the right, this is American Sign Language. What I just told you about is over here. They're separate languages. We know that. You can see they're separated. But what is all this in the middle? You know, we hear a lot of people talk about different ways to express sign language, and they'll use sign language as a generic term to cover any manual communication. But there is a distinction, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but I wanted to give this to you because it's another point of confusion when we talk about American Sign Language. We know it's its own language over here. We know English is its own language. There is actually English that can be signed manually. So you can stay in the English language and you can sign it on your hands. Now remember, I said American Sign Language is not English on the hands. It's not. It's its own language. But you can take this language, spoken English, and communicate it manually on your hands with sign language. The difference is, over here I'm using the grammar, the syntax, the structure of this language when I sign it. I'm using the vocabulary of this language or signs that are specific to American Sign Language. Over here, I'm doing the same thing. I'm using the grammar, the syntax, the idioms, the structure of the English language, only I'm putting it on my hands. So over here, I'm saying that chair's red. On on American Sign Language, I'm saying chair there, red. I'm just using the different structures, and I'm using specific signs for each. In the middle here, if you've ever heard of pidgin languages, that's what we're going to call this, any point between this end of this scale at American Sign Language and this scale at English. All this in the middle is what's called pidgin Sign English. There are other forms of pidgin languages, and really all it is, it's two languages that come together just to try to understand each other. So it's really a blend of two languages. This occurs in Latin American countries. It occurs in Irish countries where you have different groups that have different languages. There are some commonalities between two languages, and people from those two different languages, they come together and they try to understand each other and communicate. And what happens is we're using grammatical features from this language or grammatical features from this language. Maybe we're using vocabulary over here or vocabulary over here, and we're blending them together to have an understanding of each other. We're not using pure English because maybe this person doesn't understand it. We're not using pure ASL because maybe the other person doesn't understand it. So what we'll do is we'll mix these languages up and get features from each just to try to communicate with people. And this is something to understand about American Sign Language. The deaf community is full of influence from English. You as hearing people, you probably don't interact with deaf people on a regular basis, but deaf people, they interact with hearing people on a regular basis every day. Unless they're isolated and they live and they work with just specifically deaf people, then they have the opportunity to come in contact with hearing people, and they have to figure out some kind of communication of their language to someone who uses another language or spoken English. And oftentimes when they try to communicate manually, I don't mean writing, but I mean in sign language, that communication is somewhere in the middle here. On this scale, if you'll think of the English language as X's, as the O's, and you'll think of American Sign Language as X's. Over here on English, everything is pure English. This is designated with a 0 on this scale. And as it gets closer to the American Sign Language, we start to see parts of American Sign Language show up until we go all the way to the other end of the scale, and it's pure American Sign Language. Conversely, if we start over here, all X's, so we're all American Sign Language. As we move closer to English, we start to see influence from the English language until we get all the way over here. So anywhere in this spectrum is called pidgin signed English. It's just a blend of the two languages. If you had a cup of pure water over here, and this is dirt, and you take one piece of dirt, one speck, one clod, whatever you want to call it, and you drop it in this cup of water, this is no longer pure water. It's a mixture. It has some dirt in it. So if you think of it that way, if I start in my manual communication, when I sign things, if I start bringing over something from the English language, maybe I'm keeping the sentence structure the same, the grammatical features are the same in English, and I start using American Sign Language signs, I've now mixed the two languages. I hope you can see that. That's a pidgin language. It's not necessarily bad. People use it to communicate. Deaf users, they hold, over here on American Sign Language, deaf users, when they communicate with pidgin, they will typically hold on to grammatical features of their language. So even though they may be using English signs, they may be using some of the word order of English, they're hanging on to the grammar of American Sign Language because it's their language. Also true, hearing users that don't have a grasp of American Sign Language, when they try to communicate and they step into this pidgin language, they'll hold on to the grammatical features of their language. And then they'll try to express things in American Sign Language and use their signs. So these users in English keep their grammar. This is overall how the pidgin works. Users over here in American Sign Language will keep their grammar, and they'll bring other parts of the other language in. And it's only natural. And even in spoken languages, the same thing holds true. Studies have shown that people hold on to the structure, the grammatical structure of their language when they try to communicate and blend with another language. It's so important to know that the distinction between these two languages, and that this pidgin is not really a language in itself necessarily. There are some arguments about whether this is a structured language, but it's just a natural blend, a natural happening when two people from two different languages try to communicate. So I hope you can understand American Sign Language is its own language. English is its own language. When you start to bring features from the other language together, you get into this spectrum called Pidgin Sign English. And that's where communication often happens between people that are hearing and people that are deaf. Because, let's face it, most people don't have a strong grasp on American Sign Language. I went to a workshop recently, and one of the deaf presenters, who's well known, he travels the country, he has his own business, and his own business is educating interpreters. And he said, I take offense to hearing people that call themselves interpreters and they don't bother to learn my language. He said, I take offense to it. Things that I've spoken of today that are deep inside that language. There's actually examples that I don't have time to give you of where improper use of American Sign Language doesn't mean just I've messed something up and they don't understand. It can actually change the meaning 180 degrees to mean something different. And this person was given us example after example of being in interpreted situations where the interpreter didn't know American Sign Language, and the interpretation came across, and it wasn't confusing to the deaf person because they signed it inaccurately and it meant something completely different to the deaf person. So it's very important. The implications for us working with deaf people in churches and in deaf ministries, it plays a key role in understanding of American Sign Language. And not all deaf people use American Sign Language. The majority of them do, but not all of them. There are some English users. I've been to quite a few interpreting assignments where they've asked me to interpret in English or use the English language manually and communicate that way. I've been to some where they've asked me to use a blend, just use pidgin. And I've been to quite a few where they are resistant to anything except American Sign Language. And for us, we need to take the time as ministers to these people to learn this language. And in doing so, you have to know that learning any language, you have to learn the culture. You can't separate a language from its culture. This means taking time with the person. This means spending time with the person. You know, the Bible talks about in the book of Mark of a multitude of people were traveling, and it uses the words, and they brought unto him, meaning Jesus, one that was deaf. And it goes on to explain that this deaf person was brought separately away from this multitude of people to be with Jesus. Working with deaf people, it's important, and not just deaf people, but think of anyone, it's important that we work on them one by one. We have to get with them. We have to meet with them on a one-on-one basis, understand where they're at in this spectrum. understand, are they English users? Are they American Sign Language users? And meet with them on a one-on-one basis and try to win them to the Lord, try to have them grow in Christ. This is such a very important part of American Sign Language, is understanding where you may fall in your usage of this language. And back to our language acquisition process. Now I hope you have an idea of what American Sign Language is more by knowing what it's not, giving you some features of what it is, but knowing also that this language process affects deaf people in their everyday life. By not a child that's born deaf and does not have this in place for the English language, because they can't hear the English language. The receptive part's not there. The expressive part is often not there. If they're fully deaf, they don't have any hearing of the English language when people speak to them. They don't have the ability, most likely, to speak the English language. Then they arrive at their formal education at 5 years old. They don't have English. They don't have the basis for it because this is gone. They have their own language, hopefully, but statistically they don't even have their own language because, remember, most parents of deaf people are hearing, and they don't have any usage of American Sign Language, so they're not trained themselves in the language. So they arrive at their deaf school or they arrive at the public school with an interpreter, and they're already behind. They're trying to teach them ABCs, 1, 2, 3s, parts of speech, and this and that. And this is the first time this deaf person has ever seen or any of this. They haven't even heard the language, haven't even tried to express it, and now they're going to be they're challenged with trying to learn it, already deficient in it. That's the reason that most deaf people don't understand the English language the way we English users do, because it's not their first language. They don't have this basis in place, so their formal learning process is already behind. And it's a challenge for schools like the Tennessee School for the Deaf when they get children in there. Not only do they have to teach them the English language at a rate that's already behind most children, but they may have to teach them their own language, because often at home with their parents who don't even know American Sign Language or any kind of signs, they have to agree upon, well, this sign, we'll call this meaning mommy. We'll call, when I do this sign, that'll mean daddy. And they just make up what we call home signs. So they get here and there's really no communication. And it's not true for everyone, but it's a large majority of our deaf children. This is the situation they're in. So as ministers of people to deaf people, people that work in churches, people that come in contact with deaf, we need to lead them to the Lord. It's important to know that their understanding of the English language is not because they can't hear per se, but it's a language problem. That's what it comes down to. And knowing that helps us in our work with the deaf. I'm a little bit past the time. I know I've gone on a lot. I have a lot more in my notes that I didn't get to. Does anyone have any questions? I'll take just a few questions before we leave.
Yeah, when they start them in regular school, I mean, are they going to teach them ASL, or is it going to be English?
When they start in school, in the formal learning process, do they teach American Sign Language or English? Typically, they teach the English language. This is the hard thing. They have something called MCE, Manually Coded English. And what it is, it was developed to teach deaf children the English language in classrooms. So when they get to school and they sit in the classroom, they try to use sign language in ways to teach deaf children the English language. And they don't use that. They don't use American Sign Language to do it. They don't use their own language. They'll use the English structure, and they'll vary sign language to try to teach them the English language. And what happens is they leave the classroom. They'll go back to their dorms. They'll go back to their homes, their communities. They'll go out to the playground, and they'll fall right into American Sign Language. Tomorrow, they get back to school. They sit in the classroom, and they'll be faced with trying to learn English with English structure. Signed English structure. And Then when they take a break and they go to lunch, this is where they go. They go back to their own language. It's a challenge for